We have all been introduced, in one way or another, to video games. Whether we've grown up playing them and loved them, heard about them through friends, bought them for our grandchildren, or just seen advertisements for them on television, we've at least been exposed to them in one way or another. And even if you claim you haven't been, this presentation will expose you to them. Now, you may think the history of video games is a relatively simple thing to discuss. It only goes to like the 1970s, right? Well, wrong. The full history of video games goes back several billion years and is fraught with war, supernovae, and communism. This is a story that I wish to discuss today in the Little Big History of Video Games. The story of video games first begins several billion years ago. Some godforsaken place out in space, a star dies and goes supernova. There's an incredibly important thing about dying stars to video games. They fuse all of the elements on the periodic table up to and including iron. And when they go supernova, these elements are blown across the galaxy and known universe. This is important because we need one of the elements out of this dying star. Silicon, with an atomic number of 14, far below iron's 26. Silicon's weird. It's incredibly common, in fact it is the second most abundant element in Earth's crust. But you wouldn't know that, because it does not occur naturally in its pure form. That's why, even though it had some uses among early civilizations and such, it was not until 1824 in Stockholm, Sweden that Swedish chemist Jönsjaka Berzelius, I believe that's pronounced, was able to obtain pure silicon. And before then, other parts of the video game story had already been set in motion. In fact, it was 800 years earlier back in France that we need to go to figure out the next part of video games story. The 100 Years' War between the kingdoms of France and England will not happen for another 300 or so years. Feudalism is expanding in the small kingdom, and during all this, some Frenchman has the bright idea to make some game that will become very important in our story of video games. The game was initially known as the Jeu de Pomme, which translates to palm game from French. Interestingly, that can be subject to some funny wordplay if you know French, because it's pronounced pretty much the same as the phrase that means apple juice. The joke over, Jeu de Pomme was played pretty much the same way as modern tennis. It did not have rackets immediately, but it eventually gained them, as well as a bunch of other things we might consider civilized in the world of tennis. Tennis itself, however, did not start being played until the 1870s, 50 years after Berzelius had discovered pure silicon. Basically, the first clubs emerged in the 1870s, and it had pretty much gained its popularity the world over by the time the First World War broke out. Bear that in mind, as a mere 4 decades after the Treaty of Versailles was signed, this would spark a man to create what would become known as the first video game. (1958) Brookhaven National Laboratory, New York State. A man is about to launch a creation that will change the entertainment market the world over forever. The man in question, William Higginbotham, had been working on radar sets during the Second World War, and he's just received the manual for a Donner analog computer. He remembers that during his time at MIT during the Second World War, he found a way to make a ball bounce around the screen of an oscilloscope, a machine typically meant for displaying sound waves. And he said on the matter, "It might liven up the place to have a game that people could play, and which could convey that scientific endeavors have relevance to society." Higginbotham immediately went to work sketching down the plans, and a few hours later, Tennis for Two was born. Tennis for Two was not necessarily the first game on an analog computer, but all the other ones were boring as heck. You had to overlay your own things in order to play them, and this was the first one that could generate its own graphics, so most consider it to be the first video game, including the Brookhaven National Laboratory, which was the place where this was displayed until it was disassembled for parts. Here's the thing though, Higginbotham didn't patent his game. He didn't even think it was that innovative. He thought it was cool that people liked it, but he had no idea what sort of innovation he was making. Although maybe it's a good thing he didn't patent it. See, because Brookhaven's a national laboratory, had he patented it, the US government would have owned the patent to the game. Because he wasn't too impressed with his invention though, Higginbottom didn't quit his day job. He kept working with radar technology and other things, and eventually went on to help found the Federation of American Scientists, and died in 1994 peacefully. More well known for his video game than his work on international relations. But even after Higginbottom stopped developing games, the industry he created kept right on trucking. In 1964, the patent for a video game was awarded to Sanders Associates, and you have them to thank for getting the things in your homes. In 1966, a man was working at Sanders Associates, and without him, the video game console as we know it today may not have been possible. This man's name was Ralph Baer, and he had developed a technology that he called the Brown Box. Baer's Brown Box device did not contain a computer, but instead contained circuitry that directly manipulated the signal going from the device to the television. Different cards included with the device would use different parts of the circuitry and thus provide different signals. The first game programmed on the device had two dot-like men running after each other. For some reason, even after seeing that, the United States government still had high hopes for the device as a military training tool. However, eventually the thought struck them that two dots chasing after each other is not a very good representation of war, and dropped the top secret status. A few years later, Magnavox themselves took the device and released it under the name Odyssey. Now you've been seeing some footage from the Magnavox Odyssey running in the background, and even though that's emulated, you can tell from it that it's not terribly technically capable. It's only capable of displaying in black and white, and it only can display a couple of boxes, maybe a larger rectangle if need be. Magnavox, however, sold physical items with the Odyssey, including poker chips, playing cards, and color plastic overlays. No, I am not joking. Later game consoles would go on to use this, but Magnavox would not be in the console market to see it, as they only released one more console before pulling out. And it may be a good thing too, because what we're about to discuss is the 1980s, the most screwed up era in the modern history of video games. If there's one thing the Soviet Union was good at, it was putting Marxism into things you didn't even think you could put Marxism into. Video games are no exception to this rule. Yes, the Soviet Union had video games. This is not exactly something you'd expect, but it did happen. There is no evidence to prove this theory, but the story goes that Nikita Khrushchev, who was Soviet leader after Stalin, visited the United States and saw arcade games, or something similar to Tennis for Two, probably. Now, he liked them and invited some people to Russia to show him their games. He then proceeded to buy them and send them off to the military to see how they worked. Now, we don't know if that's true, but video games did certainly appear in the Soviet Union around the 1950s and early 1960s, which is around this time this story would have taken place. Arcade games were scattered all about the Sovietsky Soyuz and arcades similar to Western countries. However, all the games were different and communist. No, I am not joking about that. All of the games had to conform with Marxist ideology, and that meant games that enhanced children's real skill. That meant no fantasy, and no Pac-Man, and no Donkey Kong, and no pretty much anything beloved to 80s children in the Western world. It also apparently meant a lot of driving games where you cannot brake or shift gear. A play on one of these machines cost 15 kopecks, an amount of money that could also buy you your lunch. This basically meant that you weren't going to be playing on the machines every day, but it didn't mean that you'd never get to play on them. It didn't mean that only the wealthy could play on them. After all, communism's all about eliminating social class, isn't it? Good old Mother Russia reminded us of that by not putting high scores in the games in any way, shape, or form. However, unfortunately for these video games, glorious Mother Russia did not stay glorious for much longer. In 1991, the Soviet Union fell and materials became incredibly scarce, so these arcade machines were broken down for parts. Some, however, did manage to escape the purge, and are now found in the Museum of Soviet Arcade Games in St. Petersburg, formerly Leningrad. It's actually quite a popular pastime for families to come here and spend their afternoons in kopecks with each other while drinking old Soviet soft drinks. And I think in a way that goes to show something about these old video games. Propaganda they may have been, but they were the good sort of propaganda. Games are supposed to be fun, and if these families wanted to play them again, then they clearly were. Leaving Lenin behind, the gaming market in Western Europe at least was blooming by 1983. However, a few kilometers to the west, things weren't doing so hot for the market. In the opening years of the 1980s, Atari controlled the video game market in North America. However, this all changed in 1983. By 1983, the company had lost so much money in the video game market that they were forced to take 14 trucks worth of merchandise, dump it in a landfill in New Mexico, and seal it over with concrete to prevent children from accessing the company's sins. One company dumping a whole load of merchandise into a landfill isn't enough to kill an industry, so let's examine what else did. It was the fact that none of their competitors jumped in on the hole in the market. There were a bunch of gaming companies in North America at the time, and none of them chose to jump in with new consoles or new games or anything that was good. Not only did this not solve the problem, it actually ruined the other companies. Great work, lads. Phenomenal. So for 2 years, the market for home consoles lay dormant, until Nintendo stepped in. A Japanese company had put out a game system the same year the crash occurred. It was known as the Family Computer, and initially Nintendo was going to offer Atari the rights to distribute it. Of course, then Atari started doing really poorly, and Nintendo was like, hey, it might be a good idea to just overpower them completely. So they did. Upon redesigning and rebranding the Famicom as the Nintendo Entertainment System, Nintendo sales skyrocketed in the US. Its only rivals in the US actually were also Japanese-based, and a brief advertising skirmish with Sega in the 1990s basically cemented their position in the North American market. And this was one of the very profound effects of the crash. It shifted major game development from North America to Japan, and it would remain that way for many, many years to come, and still remains that way to this day. And that's the way the 1980s ends, bringing us up to a perfect segue into today. In conclusion, video games have indeed been around a very long time, an even longer time, in fact, than their creators. True, they may not have been essential to the development of humankind, but for some of us, they have been essential for the structuring of our lives and friendships. Some of us more than we'd like to think. And hey, if you picked up nothing else from this, at least the next time your mother tells you to go and talk with your real friends, you can tell her the video game is in fact a distant cousin of yours.